So, welcome everybody. This panel or conversation is about a book by Akash Kapur, which really is very well known by now. And the book is called Better to Have Gone: Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Auroville. It's by Akash Kapur, and I'll read a little blurb about it. In the late 1960s, two lovers converge on an arid patch of earth in South India. John Walker is the handsome scion of a powerful East Coast American family. Diane Maes is a beautiful hippie from Belgium. They have come to build a new world, Auroville, an international utopian community for thousands of people. Their faith is strong, the future bright. How do John and Diane end up dying 2 decades later on the same day on a cracked concrete floor in a thatched hut by a remote canyon? This is the mystery Akash Kapur sets out to solve. Better to Have Gone, and it carries deep personal resonance. Diane and John were the parents of Akash's wife, Auralice. Akash and Auralice grew up in Auroville like the rest of their community. They never really understood those deaths. So this is the background of the book that many people have read. And if you haven't read it, I'd encourage you very strongly to read it. Akash Kapur has written a number of other books, and particularly a book called India Becoming, a portrait of life in modern India. He has edited an anthology, Auroville, Dream and Reality, which is also a very good book on Auroville. The formal letters from India, columnist for the New York Times, and the recipient of a Whiting Grant. He's a senior fellow at the Government Lab at New York University, has taught at Princeton, and is on the founding academic advisory team for Kriya University in Chennai. So welcome, Akash. So here, what we'd like to do is conduct a bit of a conversation around this book. And perhaps we'll start with Akash, if you can say a few words about what got you into writing this book and what your thoughts are about it after having written it now.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. And then I hate giving lectures, so I'll talk very briefly and then hope we can, we've had some nice conversations, so I hope we can do that. I guess, to talk about the genesis of the book, how it sort of became what it became. It's a very multi-stranded book, which made it very complicated to write. It had many different things going on that I had to sort of fit together like a puzzle. But it began as a very personal book, actually. It began that the core strand of the book remains very personal. And as you alluded to in that description you just read out, the somewhat embarrassing description because it's put together by the publishers, not the not the authors, and the authors have very limited control over that type of stuff. But anyway, it started with my wife and I moved back to Auroville. We've been away for over a decade. We moved back to Auroville, and my wife had this story in her past, which we knew, and we sort of thought it was in the past, that her mother and her stepfather, kind of adopted father, had died on the same day in somewhat mysterious circumstances. She never really understood what had happened. She was 13 years old when it happened. And we moved back and we found this past still very much present and kind of hanging over us. And so the book begins as an attempt, it's a very personal kind of excavation of what happened there. And I found a lot of his letters, her adopted father, John Walker, I found his letters, his diaries. He was a very beautiful writer. He had been writing to his family in the US. And that's what got me excited and inspired to write this book. I quickly learned that their story intersected with a kind of broader historical story in Auroville. And so the second strand of the book is basically history of a community and history of Auroville. The direct way in which they intersected was through the figure of Sapren, who I'm sure many of you know about and are familiar with him, close disciple of the mother, who was responsible for putting the agenda out in the world. And Sapran had been fairly close to Auralice's mother, Diane, and there was a lot of correspondence between them. And I have to be honest that when I found that intersection, I almost dropped the book because I thought, this is not the book I want to write. I had lived through those years surrounding that sort of historical period when Sapran was a very prominent figure in Auroville. They were very tumultuous years. I had been a child during that time. They were tumultuous, and honestly, they were sort of frightening years, or at least they had sort of scarred me. And as I found out, many other people who had lived through those years, and I really didn't want to be revisiting them for a whole bunch of reasons. And so there was a part of me that thought, I'm not going to write this book. Like, I want to write a personal book about my wife's family. I don't want to be sort of like reopening these old, closed cupboards and see what spills out. Anyway, I ended up writing the book. And in the process, I learned that a lot of what we think of as history is still very much in the present. I spoke to people that I have known all my life from a distance, but now I was able to approach them with the somewhat, call it professional distance of a writer, and I'm able to ask them questions somewhat objectively and hear their stories. And I learned a lot about the history of my town. I reframed a lot of that history in my own head. And I guess one of the things I would say, bringing it into the present, is that, as we know, history is never over. And that's something I really saw firsthand, that history is not history, and the done with history is a continuous process. And much the same way we see that at a global level, like you see World War I leads into Versailles, leads into World War II, leads into the Cold War, leads into what's going on, in Ukraine now. I think similar things have happened in Auroville, and much of what we see happening in Auroville today, I'm sure many of us are familiar with some of the tumult and distress in the community now, very much directly leads from those events and some of the currents that were set in motion from that period that I was writing about in the late 70s and the early 80s. And so, although the book is set in the past, there is very much that kind of present element to the book. And I would say, so those are the two first strands, the personal and the kind of historical. There's a third strand hovering over all of this, which is the more conceptual, or it sounds somewhat pretentious, but I guess philosophical kind of strand, which is this broader kind of search for perfection and a search for a more perfect world. And what does it mean to be attempting to be building a more perfect society and a more perfect world? And in a kind of spiritual sense, you might call that the quest for yoga, in a kind of spiritual, in a personal kind of spiritual sense. In a more secular, collective sense, I use the term utopia in the book. And the quest for utopia and the ambition for utopia, which I think has annoyed a few people in Auroville, friends and colleagues of mine. And I understand that, because utopia is a complicated concept. Like in Thomas More's original concept, utopia is both the perfect place, but it's also no place. And if you call a place utopia, you're implying that it doesn't exist, it can't exist. And so I think some people sort of resent my use of the word utopia, and I understand that, and I accept that. And I think what interests me is not the sort of no place in utopia, but it's more the utopian ambition than utopia itself. And it's sort of that area that exists between reality and the dream, and the effort to achieve a dream. And the dream may or may not be achievable, but we are in the moment where we are still trying to achieve this more perfect world and this dream world. And that's sort of the territory that I'm trying to explore in the book. And it's a very complicated place, at least for me, because both at an individual personal level of the characters I write about and the community, you're really, there's this intersection between the nobility of the aspiration, the nobility of the dream, and then it's sort of like it keeps bumping up against sort of less illuminating or less, inspiring aspects of human nature. And that collision between kind of dream and reality is something that very much interested me, and I feel like I'm exploring that border in the book. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's kind of a sort of summary of the book, and then I'm happy to take questions or talk or whatever.
Yeah, thank you, Akash. I think that's very beautifully laid out in terms of the three layers that your book contains. And actually, what's interesting is that when it came out, which is was it last year, a year before last? Last year, yeah. I think this aspect, the history had really gone underground. People going to Auroville didn't know anything about it. Even people living in the ashram afterwards, if you told them something about it, many people didn't know anything about it. and the future, which is what you're talking about regarding the kind of way in which these things repeat and come back, and the difficulties that we see today had not arisen. So it's almost like a kind of a prescient moment between times that you suddenly unearthed something. And it's also interesting because around the same time, some other people, it's the fifth, or it was just past the 50th year of Auroville. And it's a few other people as well. Or one of the persons that you refer to in your book, Amrit, wrote his book called Children of Change, that actually deals to a big extent with the same history. And it's a troubling history, as you pointed out. You lived through it when you were a child. And for us who've never lived through it but have heard of it, I myself heard snippets about it before you wrote it. It was very troubling. And once it was out in the air, for those who've read it, you know, it's tremendously troubling. Some people find it very difficult to come to grips with. And I can understand how it must have been, as you said, you almost dropped the project. But from a certain point of view, it was, I think, a tremendous service, because it brought to light unresolved forces that were just waiting to awaken, relive themselves. So I just wanted to appreciate the fact of the work. I mean, it must have been a very difficult job to do. And I think we are still grappling with what it means, both as people close to Auroville from the outside, but also people connected with the larger project that you're talking about, the idea of both of utopia and of the possibilities of perfection that the integral yoga proposes. So I'd like to.
Yes, sure. You know, one of the things that I appreciate, Akash, in your book is the challenge of trying to be as, okay, we were talking about objective and subjective in the previous panel. There's a certain, you know, positionality that you have to assume when you're dealing with something that's so close to you, and yet at the same time you have to be you know, truthful to the bigger, you know, issues playing out. And I think you are able to navigate that really well. So I just want to, you know, first just appreciate that approach that you have, which feels fair and sincere and honest, even though it involves issues which can be very polarizing. The second sort of issue that I want to raise up, and this is more in the I would love to hear what you have to say about this also, is that in communities like Auroville and even the ashram, you know, where something is being worked out over time, though they were established many decades ago, they are very contemporary, relevant spaces where there is a work of consciousness happening. And there is something of a, you know, the cradle of a new world kind of perspective that you can, you know, take to interpret and understand what's taking place. I feel also that it's important to resolve historical challenges or issues. Like, for example, when we had in the ashram, we had a lot of controversy around Peter Heese's book in 2008. And for a period of, you know, 5 to 7 years, there was a real turmoil and turbulence in the community. And I remember when I was very much present. I was in the middle of these things because I was, you know, helping. I was working in one of the administrative departments of the ashram, and I remember thinking that so many of the problems that were coming up were actually not so much about the book, but about issues that were unresolved from the past. And this to me is something which I think about, that if somehow if we don't have the courage to face and confront challenging polarities of the past, if we just sort of sweep them under the rug, they're going to come back and trouble you later. And I think that is a cycle that maybe I want to hear from you whether you think that's something that is also pertinent to Auroville.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think some element of what's going on now in the community is a sort of pendulum swing in the opposite direction, right? And when you don't deal with extreme events, as you say, when you don't unpack them, you end up having strong reactions to them, and then you switch between reaction and counter reaction. And sometimes these play out over a matter of months or years, and sometimes they play out over decades, which I think is what's happening now. And I guess the question is, it's like, what is the forum or what is the institution that Auroville would have had for working these things out? A friend of mine recently was visiting Auroville. He was involved, he's South African, he was involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee there. And he was very interested in Auroville. He didn't know anything about any of the sort of problems in the community. But he went there, and I introduced him to a few people, and they had sort of conversations about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa and what they had done. And I mean, frankly, Auroville's never had a process like this, right? It's never had a forum, a sort of safe space where different people could speak about their hurt, their pain, the reasons for what they did. And I think that's a real shortcoming, and I think the community is sort of like suffering from that and will continue to suffer from that. I feel this is sort of characteristic of a more general thing that has happened in Auroville. And I say this as someone who has spent the better part of my life there and loves the community and thinks there's so much amazing energy and amazing things going on there. But one of its big failings is that it's never established any kind of internal lasting governance structure within which we would be able to work out these types of differences, right? Like our governance structure would change every 2 years. You'd have new elections to the working committee with new systems that nobody could keep track of. And therefore, like the kind of constant experimentation in the search for fora in which to work these out meant that, in my view, the conversation never happened. So yeah, I agree very strongly with your point. And I think that we're still very, very much in that cycle. Like, I don't think we're beyond that cycle at all.
Akash, I think, yeah, that's a very important point. The lack of the lack of any process to bring about reconciliation. But there's another aspect to the whole thing which emerged at that point, which also is part of the other problem that Devdip talked about in the ashram, and may also be part of the problem right now, which is the lack of parity between the parties. If you're talking about reconciling problems and sort of grievances among equals, processes are possible. But how do you deal with it when there is a tremendous lack of parity? There's a power differential that is completely unequal. Somebody holds all the power. Somebody else, has to beg for existence in that case. So it's a really difficult situation, and I wonder how you perceive the possibility of a dialogue under those.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with that. I guess what I would say is that the lack of parity stems from an appeal to an external authority or an external force. And if you go back to what happened in the 80s, people would say that, I'm using simplistic language, people would say that one side went out and appealed to the government to come in and sort of impose their solution. And then now people would say that another side went and hitched their cause to the government's authority, right? So, that lack of parity that you're referring to, I feel the force comes from outside the community. And the force steps into the community because the community, where in fact you do have parity between members of the community, is unable to have the conversation itself and work its differences out. So I agree with your point, but I think that lack of parity stems from the problem that I identified earlier, which is that if the community had an internal process to have these conversations in a respectful, fair way, balanced way among members of the community, you wouldn't necessarily end up in this lack of parity with an external authority coming in and kind of imposing a solution.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Akash. Maybe we can talk a little bit about Yes, would somebody, if you have questions, feel free to, come in. I think Robert has a question. Yes.
Check.
Hello, Ashok.
Yeah, just hold it a bit closer.
Yeah, okay. Hello, Ashok. Nice to see you again. Last time we were at the panel, David
Yeah, I remember.
and I and you and two other people. Yeah. And since then, I've thought about the book and the complex phenomenon that you tried to explain and did so very well. I have two questions. One is following up on the comments in the last few minutes about governance. And then a very particular question about governance. I'm wondering whether you agree that Auroville, founded in the same year as CIIS, has a similar problem to our institution here, namely that at some level, there's a lot of romantic idealism about a kind of governance by anarchy. But in fact, anarchy requires very enlightened participants. And we have discovered that we are not that enlightened. And so we keep failing in different ways, but essentially the same problem. And when I read about Auroville, I keep getting that same idea, sort of to say, this is too hard, and yet it should be tried. In fact, it even needs to be tried. And I'm wondering, did you come away, either while writing the book or since you now have had about a year and a half or 2 years since it was published, about thoughts about governance? Are they trying to do something too hard? Is it possible to do what they're trying to do if they would agree on certain forms, certain agreements, certain limitations? What kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know anything about your organization's governance things, but the broader point that this comes out of the 60s, out of a kind of, romantic view of anarchism and anti-authority stuff is spot on. And I think the reason Auroville does not have sufficient governance mechanisms is because people have been trying to reject existing traditional governance mechanisms, which I understand and which I sympathize with. It's been a kind of constant search for an alternative, right? And they've never quite landed on a workable alternative. And so, I remember having a conversation with somebody once. I was younger and more naive, but about democracy. And I don't know that I would necessarily still subscribe to this view now, but I was, giving I think it's the Winston Churchill view of democracy, that it's like the worst form of system, except, like any other one that's known, or whatever the saying is. But anyway, there's been a strong move within Auroville against anything that would reek of the old world when it comes to governance. And I think I understand that, but then the inability to sort of settle on a new decision-making structure has been problematic. And to me, all the problems, practically all the problems that the community has are manifestations of that problem. Like we argue over roads, or we argue over forests, or we argue about trading lands. These are the types of disagreements that societies have, right? These are the types of disagreements that countries have. And then they have structures and mechanisms for working out these disagreements. Whether it's democracy, whether it's dictatorship, whether it's like, enlightened rulership by a certain class, whatever it is, those mechanisms have been absent in the community to work out these differences. And so they just simmer and simmer and simmer and simmer over the decades, building up in intensity, developing all kinds of personal dimensions, because after all, these are people who've been arguing about these things now for decades, and so it's become very personal. And that's like, and then we end up in the sort of situation we're at now. So those are my thoughts on governance. I mean, I guess like the one thing, couple further thoughts is, I feel the problem is very tricky, because I feel when Auroville was 150 people, it might have been possible for them to sit in a room and work out what, for lack of a better word, you would call a constitution or some kind of like governance structure. There might have been a possibility to work out how Auroville should be run at that point. It's 3,000 bickering people now. I don't know how you work it out now. I don't know, like, it feels that the community will not reach a level of like agreement to work out on the sort of basic rules of operation. And I always felt when I was there, in the early 2000s, and I always felt the best thing the government could do for us is impose some kind of decision-making structure on us. Not tell us what to do, but tell us kind of like, give us some kind of format, however broad, to force us to get our own house in order and make our decisions ourselves. And it never happened.
Okay, not to prolong, but just to add a little footnote. So the mother founded Auroville in 1968, but then she died 5 years later. And Haridas Chaudhuri founded this institution in 1968, and he died 7 years later. And in both institutions, there has not been that kind of authority again. And there shouldn't be, because there wasn't anybody at that level. But as a result, the form that they embodied couldn't be implemented again. And so then both institutions have been scrambling to get something like that, even though the people implementing it are perfectly ordinary. So it seems to me a fascinating problem.
Yeah, I would add to that, if I may, that one of the remarkable things about Auroville is that if you look at the history of communities like Auroville throughout the ages, they tend to last about as long as their founder lasts. Which is to say that when the founder is gone, whether it's in 5 years or 20 years, the communities tend to fall apart. And I think Auroville stepped pretty close to the edge back in the 70s, but it's actually amazing and remarkable that it didn't go away and that it's still there. And in 2018, when we celebrated the 50th anniversary, I just felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude, right? Like, despite everything, I was in the middle of researching this book, and despite everything that this community has been through, despite that, that really stepping to the edge of the precipice, we're still here. And I felt huge gratitude and a certain amount of surprise about that. I think, given what's happened since then, like, I temper the gratitude or the optimism I felt then a little bit, but that is what I felt back then.
Yeah, and CIS is still here and more so than ever. So I've been both institutions are successful, though imperfect. Now I have another question, but if other people are waiting, I can wait.
Please go ahead.
Proceed. Okay, yeah. It's a very particular question. I left the book and the discussion that we had a year and a half ago with a certain troubling question about Satprem. Is there anything you want to add about your thoughts about the role of Satprem?
I would love to hear the troubling bit you felt. I would say that it was in some ways the most sensitive aspect of the book, and that the feedback, the most polarizing feedback I received, both positive and negative, that is pleased with me but also angry with me, involved his role and the way he was portrayed. And the only thing I can say, trying to be as objective as possible right now, is that I came away from the process of writing the book thinking that he was absolutely central and instrumental to the history of Auroville in a way I had maybe sort of known, but not quite fully understood. And that he played this absolutely pivotal role in the history and development of Auroville.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add one thought which adds to our conversation here, which is that communities like Auroville, essentially, I mean, for me, the reason that they are founded, or that it was founded, was precisely to be a kind of laboratory experiment where all these new modes of being and working can actually be figured out. So while I totally get what you're saying, Akash, about the frustration of not being able to do that adequately, it seems to me like the failures are also very much a part of the process. I mean, that failure or inability to arrive at some kind of a meaningful structure is partly the whole point of getting there eventually. I mean, that's just a thought I wanted to put in, which doesn't justify the failures, but I'm just saying it's an important part of the process. One has to fail many times before we can truly come up with something that represents or embodies a new form of consciousness.
I very much agree with that. And I, at a personal, emotional level, am very sympathetic with that point of view. that this is all part of the process, right? And that we're sort of working our way towards something. I think the problem is, like, if you look at the current situation, I think a certain segment of the community lost patience with the process. And, you know, I have my views on that. I think they lost, the way I characterize it is not flattering, right? I say they lost patience with the process. Their view is, we've been sitting around 50 years waiting for something to happen. How much longer are we going to wait? And people are blocking everything. And I get that view. And those views were being voiced, you know, informally for like at least a decade before all of this stuff happened. And I really do understand that. The question is that if this is a kind of organic, possibly divinely led process that's playing itself out, short-circuiting it may not be the best way to get to the end of the process.
I don't have a question as much as just a comment and sharing of my thoughts. Firstly, when I was in Auroville, I remember being told or sensing, I don't have any rights here, and how liberating that was. That I guess being an American, feeling like I have both civil and human rights, that I was free of feeling that I needed to stand up for myself and exercise any particular right. But I wanted to comment on the discussion involving leadership of Auroville, and that the great thinkers, great leaders should be empowering the people in Auroville. Not that Auroville continues to look towards leadership, but that each person be empowered to be autonomous and fulfill the vision of that autonomy in its fullness. And if members of Auroville cannot succeed under a toxic regime such as the government of India, we cannot blame those Aurovillians for not creating the kind of vision that they came to Auroville to create.
I'm trying to think what best to respond to in that. I guess I would just say the current situation has been going on for relatively short time and feels to me like the culmination of something that was going on within the community for 30 years. So that's what I'm referring to when I refer to the absence of governance or decision-making within the community. I'm saying that there was a shortcoming and there was a lacune among us. I mean, I've sat around with friends and I've talked about our responsibility. I was asked many times, will you join the working committee? I had my reasons. I said, no, I'm not interested, okay? Like, we all had chances to be involved and take responsibility for how Auroville should be. And many of us had opinions rather than acted. And I think that's where we've ended up. And I think that what Auroville has not achieved in 50 years is not because of what's gone on in the last 2 years. I think it's because of what happened in the 48 years previous to that. That's not to blame. I'm just saying what's happening today is an outcome, not necessarily the cause of things.
Akash, I'm thinking about your third layer, and it's, you know, how it's involved with the whole thing, how it's inextricably connected with the whole thing, and also the nature of things around that time. There is a historical element there, a historicity to the entire event, which is what's going on at the end of the 60s, the types of people you're talking about, the general countercultural atmosphere throughout, I'd say at least the Western world, and the easy way in which rationality is thrown aside. And I think there, and even when we are talking about utopia and spirituality, I think the occult becomes a very large part of this book. Talking about Satprem, for example. accepting or refusing ideas just based on somebody's word or charisma or claim that they're receiving divine guidance, or this is the thing to be done because some being within told them so. What do you think about this? And do you think that there's been any sobering lesson learned from it in today's world, in today's Auroville, or is a similar atmosphere there today as well?
Yeah, I mean, in writing the book, as you or Debashish referred to, I was trying to be fair and trying to sort of be as balanced as possible. And so I was putting my cards on the table that I'm obviously, for better or for worse, and I don't mean this as a compliment necessarily, a hyper-rational being who has trouble understanding some of this occult language and has trouble relating to it. Nonetheless, I've grown up around it, and many people I highly respect seem to understand it better. And so I was trying to be, open and respectful and sympathetic to it, while also sort of stating the way I saw it. So anyway, that is one thing I would say. I don't know, I guess I would have said 3 or 4 years ago, I would have told you, yes, I think the community's learned a lot of lessons, and that we sort of moved on. And I wouldn't even phrase it in terms of, frankly, rationality or occultism. I would actually phrase it in terms of like kindness, maybe, and mutual respect and a kind of humaneness. Because what struck me about those years, and I write about this in the book, is the willingness to cause great damage to our family members, to our neighbors, to our friends in the name of an ideal, and that's what offended me the most. And so I would have said 3 or 4 years ago that I think we're in a better place that way. I'm not so sure anymore, because things have happened that make me question that, and trying to remain, watching what's happening now and trying to remain as sort of fair and agnostic about the issues per se, and trying to sort of like see both sides of it, and sometimes understanding both sides of it, right? Like, are we arguing over a road here? Are we arguing over a city? Maybe. But what I can't abide is the cruelty. And that part of Auroville has surprised me, because I thought that there were certain kind of ground rules. We refer to each other as family members, brothers, sisters, whatever. I guess the lesson is families do crazy things to each other. I mean, we've seen that happen over and over. So that part of it has surprised me, and I have to be honest, very, very much disappointed me.
I think one of the things, Akash, that is very interesting in these kind of situations is that people on both sides of the table, if you look at their intention, their fundamental intention, they would like to sincerely do what they believe is right. So that to me is firstly very interesting, that it's not as if there is malice to begin with. There is really an intention that we have to try and do what each believes is divine will or the highest truth or an ideal. So I think what is interesting, and maybe here Debashish might want to, you could say, add a little bit. I think what is interesting is that what distinguishes a perspective or an action which is true vis-a-vis something which is not true. And there is an element of discrimination that comes in, contextual discrimination. What I mean by that is that it is not so much about a given action per se, but the consciousness behind that intention. So this ties into something we've been discussing in this conference over the last 2 days, which is subjectivism and false subjectivism. What do we consider our true center or self, and where we are acting from? And many of these conflicts, whether it's in Auroville or in the ashram, can actually be seen in these terms, that there is sincerity of intention, but the way that is translated can sometimes feel, depending on who you talk to, completely misguided or misdirected. And I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution to this problem, but I just think that this is precisely the kind of challenges that these sort of aspiring to be spiritual communities need to work out. And one thing that I'm reminded of, and I'll just end with that, this comment with that, is there's this interesting conversation with the mother about Sri Aurobindo and his vision of things. And she says, I'm paraphrasing, but somewhere, the element of compassion and love and wideness are very important.
Mhm.
And to me, they are kind of markers for giving a certain direction. But I mean, I have to develop this thought a little more, so I will stop here. And
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Devdip. I wanted to, also think along those lines a little bit about subjectivism, as you said, because this is the large field. Sri Aurobindo, to some extent, is talking about an entry out of the rational age into the subjective age. And in a sense, this is what it is. Then a subjective age has to look for other forms of validation for its action than just the reason. He's also saying that you don't throw your common sense out. You have to utilize your reason along with your whatever subjective guidance you're going by. But he does give some guidelines, and that's where you're talking about discrimination. I don't know whether it's compassion. I think compassion is an important thing, but I think he's pointing to some other things as well. I think some of the things have to do with, limiting idealisms like ethnocentrism, or other ways in which we try to take our subjective views and apply it to some and create others through it. But maybe there are ways of understanding this discrimination, because if you're going to not rely purely on the reason, yes, we can have compassion, but at a certain point, compassion sort of hits the wall with ideals, and people who have the greatest compassion find it difficult to, break through these
the
strongly
obstacles.
held ideals and become enemies overnight sometimes, which we find in many cases.
I think we can, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, we have a question from Earl Blauner, so I'll ask it here. In regard to process, can the panelists see any potential for the power or the force going the other way, and that Auroville can have a positive influence on the government of India?
Yeah, so sorry, Akash, that's for you. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that Auroville is a political force or should be a political force in the modern Indian context. So I feel like Auroville's influence on India that has been going on for a few years is in areas of sort of work that Auroville has done and expertise that has developed over the years. For example, there was a lot of sharing of green work expertise and sort of rejuvenation of Chennai's waterways, working with the Tamil Nadu government and things like that. So I feel that predates the current situation. And when people would say in the past that Auroville, feels like a bubble and it's isolated from India, and there was some truth to that, I think those are the types of areas where you could have seen more kind of, whatever you want to call it, goodwill or power emanating from Auroville towards the external. I also just wanted to say one thing, picking up on what Devdip and Debashish were just saying earlier. Devdip, you were talking about sincerity of aspiration on all sides. And I strongly agree with that. I think with few exceptions, I think some people do get into power or whatever, and that's a slightly different thing. But I think for the most part, with few exceptions, there is very much sincerity on both sides of the current conflict in Auroville, and people think that they are trying to do their best, right, for Auroville, and think that their version is the truth. To me, this is maybe what we're talking about subjective and objective. Truth is a troubling concept because we all have our own notions of the truth, and this is where we land into trouble. And therefore, I guess I'm more interested in a kind of values-led approach to resolving some of these things. And what I mean by that is the kind of compassion or love or mutual respect-led approach that you were talking about earlier, than I am by arguments about the truth, because I think truth is inherently subjective. But I do think that both sides have been sincere, and I also think that both sides have caused pain to each other, by the way. I've certainly talked to people whom one might think they are on the side of the power now, and they might even be, but they're also operating out of a place of, you know, deep ostracization and hurt and sort of feeling like they were very much misunderstood. So it's a pretty tangled situation that way right now.
I also want to just bring in one more idea into the conversation, because I've like heard it, you know, said a few times this morning. When people speak of the government of India, I say this to some of my Aurovillian friends. I say, look, there is a governmental structure in Auroville, in which, you know, which was done by the Foundation Act, by which there is a secretary and so on and so forth. But I think there is a kind of relative importance that we must understand. I mean, in the context of India and of, you know, a country of, you know, 1.5 billion people and rapidly growing and changing remarkably in so many ways, this community of 3,000 people has its place, certainly, and it's very important. We understand its importance in the spiritual sense, but sometimes I tell them, look, it's not really that important in the overall picture of a nation that is, you know, in the process of transforming itself materially. And I'm just trying to highlight that it's not so much government as opposed to the governmental structure that is created by an act, which is the Auroville Foundation and so on. So and also, so it's I think sometimes when we position the problem in these terms, we are actually problematizing it even more. It's as if it's the two sides. I feel like we are characterizing the two aspects of the problem. I just thought I should put that out. And of course, I don't mean to say that in an occult or spiritual sense, it's enormous, the value of Auroville. But at a national level, there are so many other challenges and problems that India is working on, that all these quibbles and bickerings for, you know, for a road or for this or that, it just seems almost childish from that perspective.
Question. Oh, your question, yes.
Okay, so Ashok, you mentioned letters, positive and negative, from within the Aurobindo community. I'm wondering how much damage did the New Yorker review do? So the review of your book was sort of thrown in with some rather unimpressive cultic type experiments, and what kind of other reviews were there, and what kind of thinking have you been doing since? I mean, have you changed your opinion? Like, you were very much sort of at a distance, as you needed to be in your book, but what about you personally in relation to Auroville, the ashram, and certain mysterious dimensions, and any kind of update that you'd like to give? I think we would find interesting.
Yeah, so the New Yorker review, I think, caused more damage to me than it did to Auroville. Let's put it that way. I think the general perception was that because I wrote a book and the publishers send a galley to a magazine and the magazine chooses to run it with books on cults, that somehow I'm involved in that process, which, you know, I would like to put on the record here, is not the case. And I was about as freaked out as anybody else when I saw that come out. So I would just like to put that on the table for the record, that if you're going to blurb any quote from this, like, it would be that one. No, because you know, a lot of people, I've heard people say, I guess who haven't read the book, say things like, you know, he called us a cult. And it's like, of course I didn't call Auroville a cult. That's not what I think of Auroville. And I get asked that question a lot, and I have very strong views on that, which I'm happy to share. So anyway, so that is one thing. I'm not sure how to answer the broader question about my views. I mean, I think you'd have to phrase that question like more specifically. Honestly, I don't know where to go with that. Sorry.
Only that at the, as I recall, I think it's in the book that you were planning to, you and your wife were going back to Auroville. So what has the experience been like since the book?
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, you know, we went back to Auroville in, was it 2004? So,
okay,
if anything, we spent less time there over the last few years, because during COVID, we had a whole story involving my wife's adoptive mother being in the hospital in the US, and we came here, and the schools being closed. So I think that, you know, my sort of evolution in terms of my relationship to Auroville happened before I wrote the book and while I was writing the book, because that was the period during which I was connecting to Auroville as an adult, right? Like I had lived there as a child, but then I came back and connected to it as an adult. And so a lot of this history, I was living through a lot of this history, like reprocessing the history as an adult, which means possibly being able to be more objective and less emotional about it, possibly trying to understand where people were coming from when certain things were happening. And then I think I was also navigating my own relationship, as we alluded to earlier, between kind of rationality and faith. And I think that when I was younger, partly because of some of the things that I had seen happen in Auroville, I was much more closed to faith, much more sort of cynical and skeptical of it, because I felt like I had seen some pretty bad things done in the name of faith and kind of shutting down one's mind. But being back in the community and possibly getting older and having kids and that kind of stuff, I think it changed my perception and left me more open and more respectful to it. And also, frankly, more specifically, because of my relationship to the key character I was writing about in the book, John Walker, who was a person of deep faith. And before I started writing the book, my narrative on John would have been, this guy died because he had too much faith. You know, his faith led him to a very dark place, and he died. And I still think that's true to an extent. But reading his letters about faith, seeing his conversations with his father, who lived in America, about what he was trying to do there, and his feelings about the mother and Sri Aurobindo and how he was navigating faith, also connected me very deeply to the sort of aspirational, beautiful quality of faith. And so that was something that I would say opened me up very much. And there's a conversation in the book where I am presenting this view to my wife and saying, well, you know, John, like he believed, like the last 10 years of his life were the most meaningful. It was the happiest I've seen him, and sort of making the case that despite the end, these were beautiful years because he had faith. To which my wife, you know, coming at it from a personal point of view, replied, yeah, but he died. And that's kind of, it's weighing those two against each other. Faith was beautiful, faith gave him meaning, faith clearly made those last 10 years of his life beautiful, but it also led him to a very dark place and he died.
Akash, I think we're coming to the end of our time. Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our time period. But one thing I wanted to ask you, which has to do with these polarized situations, as you talked about it even now, and as you write about it in your book, because it's really a process that you take us through the process. And we realize that just like any reaction, that there are points of reversibility, you know, that it could have gone some other way. You know, people could have been more open to each other. They could have worked it out, etc. But there's a point of time where it tips over, the balance tips over. It becomes an irreversible, polarized process. And you maintain a kind of, largely objective kind of equality about the whole thing. But there is a sense that your preference would be for a kind of neutrality. If you look at, for example, Amrit's book, that's his ideological stance. He was a neutral, and that was one of the three camps that arose at that time, the neutrals. And the neutrals were really vilified by both sides. They became the sort of target for both sides. And that's one of the things where, you know, when we talk about Satprem, we see how a kind of a hate campaign, even against the neutrals, is unleashed among these people. But do you think in that respect, would you say that a community like this, after things become almost irreversible in terms of polarization, is there a place for neutrals in a situation like that? Or would you say there should be tolerance towards neutrals in a place like that, but it's almost as if they, I mean, people are being pushed to take one side or the other.
Yeah, a few thoughts. I clearly am not a fan of polarization, for better or for worse. I think it was one of your students, right, that said something like I was too reasonable in the book, or too kind of like saw too many points of view. And I understand where that's coming from. And some of the people that I talked to from, for the book, their feedback to me was basically, you don't understand what was going on, and you don't understand the need for action at that time. And it's fine from this perspective to sort of advocate neutrality, but something had to be done. And so maybe, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm like in my mind and I live in some ideal place where I think everybody could get along, and I don't understand the reality. But it's funny that after all these years, it still feels like a courageous thing to say, but I am sympathetic to the position of the neutrals, as I understand it from this perspective. And that has earned me some ire in Auroville, right? Because people still write me angry letters about that. And I've had people write to me, accuse me of wanting to give Auroville back to the Sri Aurobindo Society, whatever that means. I'm sympathetic to the position of the neutrals because they were non-polarized, also because I think they were victims of human cruelty, which I don't like at all. And I still see some of that happening now, and I think it takes courage in today's Auroville to have a balanced perspective, to not personalize things. It's difficult in a situation of conflict. It's difficult. I suppose one of the lessons I'm learning, sort of being more adult and going through this today, is that neutrality is a complicated position when you're in the thick of war. And so to look back on what happened 40 or 50 years ago and feel sympathetic to the neutrals is easy when things are happening and when there's an action on the ground, as there are, let's say, these days. It's harder, right, at that moment to just say, I don't have a view on this, or I will try to remain outside this, because of course in doing that, you're sometimes de facto expressing a view. So I think neutrality is a complicated position despite my broad sympathy to it. I just want to say on the question of can we come back from polarization, it's not true, as people have accused me, that I would give Auroville back to the society. I don't even know what that means, right? I think it's a silly accusation. However, I think one of the saddest things that came out of that conflict in the 70s and the 80s was the split between the ashram and Auroville. Okay, I think it was sad and unnecessary. And I lived through that myself because I spent some years in the ashram and my grandparents were in the ashram. And I was somehow, actually, I and my family were able to navigate it a little bit better than some people, right? I never felt totally excommunicated or excluded, but a lot of people did. In any case, I think it was sad at a spiritual level, at a practical level, at a philosophical level, at a human level. The good news is that I think it's taken a long time, but I see that polarity easing quite dramatically, right? I mean, I go to Pondicherry and I have coffee with Devdip and we talk about these things. I think that's, it's taken a while, right? But it's a sign that these polarities can over time ease. And I think that's hopeful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Akash. On the position of neutrality, I mean, some of our people, some of our students also met with Amrit a couple of times. And the interesting thing about it was that Amrit has a spiritual view on neutrality at that totally irreversible position. He feels that it's due to neutrality and openness and calling on the mother to intervene that his power lay. And he's not necessarily saying everybody has to do that, but he was saying that a community has to have place for people like that who feel that they don't need to act directly, but can, through their neutrality, call for a higher force or something like that to occur, which I thought was an interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and I mean, I would broadly agree with that, and I think that you need space. You need to create and allow the space in the community at times like this for all voices, even if they're sort of anathema to you or seem to be taking very destructive positions. And it doesn't serve a community to just label them as asuras and refuse to listen to them. I don't buy that at all.
I also think that there is a certain power in stillness and in sort of individual silence and calling for, I don't know, calling for help, for balance, for harmony. These are all very powerful tools when they're done individually and many individuals doing it at the same time. Sometimes it opens the possibility for, shifts in the consciousness of the community. Also, so I think that's where another thing why neutrality sometimes, especially if it's a spiritual position, can actually effect change outwardly as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Akash. This was a lovely conversation, very engaged. And I'm hopeful that our audience, you can see few people here, but there's many people online at the same time, could get some more illumination about your book and would feel interested in reading it.
Wonderful.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. It would have been fun to be there in person, but next time.